here at the College of St. Catherine, and it's my pleasure to welcome you here this afternoon to hear our honored speaker, Professor Noam Chomsky from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. Professor Chomsky will speak for about an hour and has agreed then to address questions. We have a microphone set up here, so for about half an hour we'll have questions. I'd ask you please to address questions from the microphone so we can all hear you. And the usual sort of regimen I've heard at these things, we'll try to keep questions to like 30 seconds, and using Jeopardy rules, please make sure your answer is in the form of a question. Thank you, I worked on that myself. Professor Chomsky's topic this afternoon, the responsibility of intellectuals in a democratic society, is especially appropriate in the context of the college's commitments and especially its new core curriculum. The college faculty have dedicated themselves to a radical renewal of our academic program centered around two core courses. First, the reflective woman, focusing on the skills and discipline necessary to live a reflective life as a fully engaged and critically responsible member of a society. And second, the global search for justice, in which we explore strategies for addressing exploitation and injustice throughout the world. The faculty have taken their lead in part from an insight at the heart of Roman Catholic teaching at its best, as expressed by the U.S. Catholic bishops, who have declared that the struggle for social justice is a constitutive element of the proclamation of the gospel. One of the most important ways we fulfill our mission as a Catholic college is through vigorous academic engagement with issues of social justice in our society and our world. On a personal note, I'd like to just observe that 3 years ago, when 4 of us from the faculty were charged with designing the common requirements for the Global Search for Justice course, we spent several days debating whether every section of this course would need to include units on the role of U.S. foreign policy, alternative economic systems, and so on. The one statement that brought immediate and enthusiastic agreement from all of us on the task force was, of course we want our students to know who Noam Chomsky is and what he says. Professor Chomsky's presence with us today is one part of realizing that purpose, and we're grateful to the Walter H. Judd Foundation, which has made this possible. This last Ash Wednesday, the notorious Catholic peace activist Philip Berrigan was arrested with 5 others for trespassing at the naval weapons plant in Bath, Maine. They poured blood and damaged missile launchers in what has become for Berrigan a lifelong war against U.S. war-making. At their arraignment, a federal judge released Berrigan on his own recognizance, declaring that everyone knows Philip Berrigan is the conscience of a generation. On the publication of Philip Berrigan's autobiography, Noam Chomsky wrote, "It is difficult to be dispassionate about Philip and his brother Daniel Berrigan. No one who knows them can doubt that they are heroic individuals, willing to do what many realize should be done, regardless of the personal cost, with a simplicity of manner and a commitment to principle that can only inspire the deepest respect. There are not too many people of whom this can honestly be said." One other person of whom this can honestly be said is Noam Chomsky. By the courage of his convictions and the intellectual rigor of his work and his writing, he too has helped to shape the conscience of more than one generation. It is a great honor to introduce our speaker this afternoon. Please join me in welcoming Noam Chomsky.
This topic, responsibility of intellectuals, it's one that I'm asked to talk and write about quite a lot. I usually decline, and I suspect I probably declined in one of my early letters. The reason is they're actually, it's a topic that I've always been uneasy about for a number of reasons. One reason is that has to do with the concept of intellectual. That's one I've always found kind of troubling. If I don't exactly understand what it's supposed to mean. If the term is used to refer to people whose minds are, say, alive and functioning, then the category vanishes pretty quickly into the mists. For just to keep the personal experience, I've known professional carpenters who's used their minds with greater creativity and imagination in their daily work than lots of people I've run into in literary salons and academic corridors and editorial offices and so on. If we put aside professional work and we just consider the exercise of the creative intellect generally, then the already weak correlation with education and status erodes still further. Again, I could give examples from personal experience, but I'm sure you can do the same, so I won't pursue it. The term is used generally to refer to a certain category of people who are supposed to somehow be the guardians of intellectual and moral values of the society. They're supposed to uphold and articulate those values, call upon others to adhere to them. And then there are several versions. One version is that they're supposed to speak truth to power in a rather famous formulation. It's another one I've always also found troubling, frankly, although I can always admire the people who try to live up to it, to that principle, though I think it's a principle that's seriously misguided for a number of reasons. One reason is that the powerful typically know the truth quite well. They generally know what they're doing, and they don't need our instructions. For another, they will not benefit from moral lessons, not because they're bad people, they need not be the case at all, but because they're playing a certain institutional role, and if they don't play that role, someone else will, as long as the institutions persist. So there's no point speaking truth to the board of directors of General Motors and telling them that they're harming their workforce and the communities and other people. If they abandoned that vocation, somebody else would be the CEO and the board of directors, because those are institutional facts, and first of all, they know it, however they disguise it, so you're not telling them any truths they don't know, and secondly, the moral lessons are misdirected because they have to do with the institutional structures and not with the individuals who happen to be fulfilling them. It would make a lot more sense to change the slogan and to speak truth to the powerless, not the power. If you speak truth to the powerless, it's possible that it could benefit somebody. So it might help people try to confront the problems of their lives more realistically. It might even help them act and organize in such a way as to compel the powerful to change structures and ways, and maybe even more significantly, to challenge illegitimate structures of authority and the institutions in which they are realized, and therefore thereby expand the scope of freedom and justice. Certainly won't happen in any other way, and it's often happened in just that way in the past. So, if anything, we should be interested in speaking truth to the powerless. But I don't think that's right either, because the task of a responsible person, anyone who wants to uphold intellectual and moral values, is not to speak to anybody, to the powerful or the powerless, but rather to speak with the powerless and to engage with them to try to learn the truth. That's always a collective endeavor, and wisdom and understanding don't come with any particular turf. Again, I'm sure your own experience shows that. A central part of that enterprise of trying to come to understand the world and our lives in it, that collective endeavor, and a central part of it is to learn the truth with others, to join with others, to try to understand the world, to figure out how it works, to improve it if we can. That, again, ought to be the slogan insofar as there is one. I should say that in the sciences, incidentally, this is just taken for granted. So there's a world-famous physicist who retired recently from MIT who used to open his freshman physics classes by saying that he wasn't going to try to describe what the class was going to cover because what is important is what we would discover, and we would discover it as we proceed. When you get to graduate education in the sciences, it's at most a kind of apprenticeship, like becoming a master violinist or carpenter or something, and in large part it's just a collective activity. The natural sciences, to put it rather mildly. Well, all of these things, as far as I can see, are basically truisms, but they also, as far as I can see, again, pretty much exhaust the topic of what's the responsibility of intellectuals. I don't think there is anything beyond truisms, and that's the main reason I feel reluctant to discuss it. I think once we clear up what seem to me confusions about things like speaking truth to power, we see what a responsible person ought to be doing. Now that's at a general and abstract level. When you, as always in human affairs, things become more difficult and more interesting and maybe even more painful when you look more closely at the specifics. So let's do that. Return to the notion of intellectual as a supposed guardian of intellectual and moral values, someone who's supposed to uphold and articulate them. Well, just about every human society, as far as I know, has a caste of people who are supposed to have a kind of expert status with regard to the moral foundations and the cultural wealth of the society. That's just as true of non-technological societies, what used to be called primitive societies, as of our own. Sometimes these people are even freed from other responsibilities and obligations to serve that function, and others are then taxed in one or another form to support them. The Levites in the Old Testament are a classic case. These groups can sometimes become a kind of priestly caste, or professional intelligentsia, as they're called in the modern secular version. Here they're sometimes called public intellectuals. Sometimes people choose that vocation without any special recognition, either material or otherwise. Some of the most interesting ones, in fact. Well, at this point, history does begin to teach some lessons that maybe go beyond truisms. For reasons that aren't too difficult to comprehend, the lessons are sharper and more clear when we look at designated official enemies. So then we're free from the temptations of apologetics and defensiveness, and we can free ourselves from that whole intricate structure of illusion and deceit that is devised almost reflexively to protect oneself from the unpleasant fate of having to look into the mirror honestly. So let's take a look at the designated official enemy, say through most of this century, that is the brutal and tyrannical Soviet system, now happily gone from the scene, though perhaps replaced by something that's even worse, so much of the population believes, apparently the majority to judge by recent polls. But let's put that aside and keep to the era from 1918 to 1989. In the West, there's a conventional way of referring to the intellectuals of that system. We make a distinction between commissars and dissidents, the bad guys and the good guys, from our point of view, which is clearly justified in this case. But they're all intellectuals, that is, in the sense that they uphold and articulate a certain system of ideals and values. The commissars upheld the official doctrines of what they called Marxism-Leninism, which survived in various attenuated forms after Stalin's death for about 30 years, finally dispatched to the grave in the Gorbachev era. The doctrine held that the Soviet tyranny was democratic and socialist. The two claims were equally valid, but they had very different fates, and that's of some interest. The claim to be democratic was, these were people's democracies, remember, The claim to be democratic was ridiculed in the West, quite rightly. It's unnecessary to give the reasons. The reasons are obvious. On the other hand, the claim to be socialist was seized upon with great delight, although it was equally ridiculous from 1917 on. There had been socialist elements in the pre-revolutionary period, pre-Bolshevik period before the Bolsheviks took over, whether you call it a revolution or a coup or whatever. There had been plenty of socialist elements, but they were immediately crushed within months, in fact. Whatever socialism means, you may debate about it, but at the very least it means control by producers over production and democratic control over the workplace and other institutions. That's the core. And that was eliminated, dismantled instantly, and never to recover. So the attack on socialism was at least as extreme as the attack on democracy and the claim to, and it was perfectly frank and open. There was nothing secret about it. It was a matter of principle by certainly right early 1918. You can argue whether it was right or wrong, but that it happened is not debatable. So the two claims are equally valid, and it's easily understood why East and West took the positions that they did on these two claims. In the East, the leadership naturally wanted to present themselves as democratic and socialist because they wanted to exploit the moral legitimacy, the moral appeal of these ideas. In the West, the pretense to democracy was, of course, ridiculed. We like to claim that one. But the pretext to being socialist was great because we could use that as a way to defame socialism by associating it with Soviet tyranny. So the socialist values and aspirations that were hated by people by the powerful in the West as much as they were by the powerful in the East, those could be defamed by this association. Well, when the world's two great propaganda systems agree on something, it's pretty hard for people to disentangle themselves from it and to free themselves from the grip. So, in fact, despite the efforts from the very early days of leading intellectuals like Bertrand Russell and John Dewey, the most prominent Marxist intellectuals, the libertarian left, and many others, despite that, the two propaganda systems won that war. That's a fact with quite significant human consequences, I think, and one that sheds a lot of light on our own doctrinal institutions and intellectual culture if we think it through. But it's, I suppose, for that very reason, almost inexpressible, even unthinkable here, which is an important fact. It merits more reflection, and it bears directly on the topic today. Nevertheless, let's put it aside and return to the Soviet system. Look back at the two categories of intellectuals and the roles they play. Well, the role of the commissars is clear enough. They upheld and articulated the official doctrine, the doctrines of the powerful and the privileged. They fulfilled the responsibility of intellectuals in one sense of the term, not a very pretty sense, but in fact the standard sense. In the West, respected Western intellectuals derided the commissars as what they called a secular priesthood, condemning them for their servility to power, which was quite right. In contrast, the dissidents stood up against the tyranny, and they were rightly honored in the West for this courageous stance. So people like Solzhenitsyn and Sakharov and Sharansky and others, or in the satellites, people, maybe Václav Havel is the most famous case. When you look a little more closely, things become more complicated, but on the surface, that's, at least that much is not controversial. Now, within the Soviet system, the picture was quite different. In fact, it was exactly the reverse. The picture that prevailed was that the commissar, what we call the commissars, the secular priesthood, they were the responsible intellectuals. They were the ones who were standing up for values, upholding the moral foundations of society, and so on and so forth. They were admired and honored and privileged. the dissidents were condemned and punished. In the post-Stalin period, that's since the early 1950s, they could suffer imprisonment and exile, for example. Now that picture is not unique to the Soviet system. On the contrary, it's nearly universal. And it goes back thousands of years to the origins of recorded history. So in democratic Athens, it was the leading dissident who was forced to drink the hemlock. And if you go back a few hundred years earlier, now we're at the beginnings of recorded history, there were a category of intellectuals. They were called then by a Hebrew word of obscure origin and meaning, which is usually translated into English as prophets, but it means roughly intellectuals. They weren't foreseeing the future or anything like that. They were condemning the powerful and their behavior, and also the corrupt society. They also devoted a lot of attention to geopolitical analysis. They warned that there was illusions being created about the nature of the way the world was working, and that it was going to lead to disaster, which in fact it did, turned out. And they were also giving a moral critique, the standard role of the dissident intellectual. But we have to be rather careful not to be misled about what was happening. The intellectuals, the prophets who we recognize now, they were dissidents and treated the way dissidents usually were. They were reviled and condemned and persecuted and imprisoned and exiled, bitterly denounced, centuries or punished severely. Centuries later, many centuries later, they were honored as the true prophets. But at the time, you go back to biblical society, it was the courtiers and the flatterers, the sometimes called false prophets. They were the ones who were honored and privileged. They were the commissars of the day. Furthermore, the prophets were not necessarily intellectuals in any narrow sense. I'm sure you recall that one of the greatest of them declared that I am not an intellectual or the disciple of an intellectual, but a simple shepherd and farmer. It's usually translated as I am not a prophet or the son of a prophet, but it means basically what I said. Again, we see very sharply in classic form the distinction between the recognized intellectuals and the people who use their minds, quite honorably in this case. We also see the pattern that then prevails throughout history from then to the origins of recorded history up until the present. The pattern of commissars and dissidents that we recognize very clearly today when we look at official enemies. Well, those are the characteristics of just about every society, including our own. The intellectuals who are honored and privileged in our own society are those who stay pretty narrowly within the framework of power and privilege. There's a certain degree of leeway, but it's not very great. The intellectuals who stand up for the rights of the poor and the oppressed and who reject the doctrines of the powerful, they typically have a rather different fate in the standard fashion. So take, for example, Eugene Debs. He was one of the most important of those who was a voice for the voiceless. Take the phrase of Archbishop Oscar Romero of El Salvador, not long before he was assassinated 17 years ago. Debs was the leading figure in the American labor movement, and during a period when labor was crushed with considerable violence and brutality. We have an unusually violent labor history in the United States as compared with other industrial societies. Debs was the leading figure in the labor movement during this period. Just to indicate how extensively it was crushed, the main most well-known labor historian in the United States, Yale University Professor David Montgomery, has a book called The Rise and Fall of the House of Labor. And he's talking about the fall of the House of Labor that he's talking about is the 1920s. There had been a rise of the House of Labor before, but it had fallen by the 1920s, or more precisely, had been battered to the ground by state violence. There was nothing left. In the automotive age, you know, the age, big age of mass production, workers had no voice in what Montgomery describes as a most undemocratic America. That's quite accurate. That was, in fact, the 1920s were hailed at the time as the end of history, you know, real utopia of the masters. Labor crushed, independent thought mostly eliminated, huge profits, everything was great. It was a little premature, it turned out, but that turns out to be a cyclic pattern. We're hearing today the same tales, and there's many times in the past. And no more reason to believe in this time than any other. Going back to Debs, the New York Times had declared Debs to be a lawbreaker at large, an enemy of the human race who should be jailed. And he later was, in fact, for failing to recognize the nobility of Woodrow Wilson's war. He was jailed on September 1918, shortly before the war ended. He had been a presidential candidate who, in fact, had been remarkably successful, considering the limited resources that are available to popular movements in this very business-run society, as it was then, like now. He ran again for president in 1920, this time from prison. The last act of the Wilson administration, Woodrow Wilson's last act, was to grant the regular Christmas pardons, Christmas 1920. Attorney General Palmer actually recommended that Debs be released, and the only official response we know of is the stamp denied on Palmer's request. Wilson had nothing else to say publicly, but in private he explained. Am I doing something wrong? Okay. In private, Wilson explained that before the war, Debs had a perfect right to exercise his freedom of speech and to express his opinion, but after war was declared, silence on his part would have been the proper course to pursue. And because he didn't pursue that course, he was thrown in jail and must stay in prison long after the war was passed. And indeed, its nobility was becoming increasingly hard to sustain. Debs was finally released, but by President Harding, not by the very vindictive Wilson, who's famous for what's called Wilsonian idealism, of which this is in fact a rather typical example. During the same years, there were other intellectuals who didn't take the same stand as Eugene Debs. The most famous of them are the main liberal intellectuals, the ones who were around the New Republic was their major journal, John Dewey's circle. That was the most important liberal intellectual journal of the day. In December 1916, the editors wrote to Wilson, actually to Colonel House, who was Wilson's chief advisor, and what they said is that their most fervent wish was to back the president up in his work and be the faithful and helpful interpreters of one of the greatest enterprises ever undertaken by an American president. What was the enterprise? Well, the enterprise was this. This was right after Wilson had won the election on the slogan of peace without victory, by which he meant victory without peace. And it's the usual fate of campaign slogans. And the problem was this great leading enterprise was to try to drive an unwilling nation into the war that they had just voted against. The intellectuals did prove to be faithful and helpful interpreters of this great enterprise. I'll give you their own estimate, which is doubtless a bit exaggerated, but at least shows how the big thinkers looked at it. They said, the New Republic wrote later, that the effective and decisive work on behalf of the war has been accomplished by a class which must be comprehensively but loosely described as the intellectuals. The nation entered the war under the influence of a moral verdict reached after the utmost deliberation by the more thoughtful members of the community who imposed their will upon a reluctant or indifferent majority, and that they considered really important. They were helped a little in this by the fact that state violence was used to still the voiceless, and the few voices who took some other view, people like Debs or Emma Goldman, who was unceremoniously tossed out of the country along with a couple of thousand others, all part of a really harsh and shameful repression which crushed the labor movement, blocked independent thought, tremendous, very strong censorship, and so on, with the support of the liberal press and the liberal intellectuals. And the result was, yeah, they were driven into war. There's a little bit more to the story. Turns out that the people who called themselves the most thoughtful members of the community were as much the victims of the effective British propaganda machine as they were purveyors of war propaganda. The British recognized that it was going to be extremely important for them to somehow drive the pacifist American country, they never could get to the population, into war. The British Ministry of Information, we now have their secret documents from those days, they defined their task as to direct the thought of most of the world, particularly the United States. That's what counted. So they therefore targeted those who described themselves as the more thoughtful members of the community, assuming that they would be the ones who would be most susceptible to the most vulgar propaganda, fabrications about Hun atrocities and so on and so forth, which proved to be quite accurate. And they carried that on with great success, and they recognized it. Sir Gilbert Parker, who headed the American section of the British Propaganda Bureau, was able to gloat about the permeation of the American press by British influence in his secret reports to the British cabinet, and in general, the more thoughtful members of the community responded appropriately to the fabrications and tales and so on, and probably they exaggerated their role, but it was quite serious. The nature of the services they rendered are also worth thinking about. The historians the Guild of Historians were particularly eager to be mobilized in this task. They constructed what they called a National Board for Historical Service. Its purpose was, I'm quoting, to bring into useful operation in the present emergency the intelligence and skill of the historical workers of the country who had to carry out the activity that they called historical engineering, explaining the issues of the war so that we might better win it. That's about right. There's been a lot more before and a lot since until today, and that indeed is the vocation of the intellectuals, the ones who are considered responsible in our society or any others. Debs was in jail, Emma Goldman was in exile, and so on. Of the individuals who sort of came out of this system, maybe the most important were Walter Lippmann and Edward Bernays. Both of them had served on Woodrow Wilson's Committee for Public Information. That was the first state propaganda agency in American history, which was picking up the fabrications of British intelligence and purveying them and trying to drive the mostly pacifist population into war hysteria and jingoist frenzy. It's interesting to look back and see what actually happened, and it's pretty amazing. Both of them were great, both Lippmann and Bernays were greatly impressed by the success of this propaganda mission. Other people were impressed too. One of them was Adolf Hitler. Hitler recognized that, and he's probably right about this, that the British won the war. British Americans won the war primarily thanks to the effectiveness of their propaganda, which the Germans were never able to counter. They didn't have anything like the British and American propaganda machines, and he vowed that next time around it would be different. They would have a good propaganda machine. Remember, this is a war that had been going back for hundreds of years. This was just the latest phase of it. In various combinations. In any event, both Lippmann and Bernays were impressed, and in the case of Lippmann, the successes of propaganda inspired him to write what are famous essays called his Progressive Essays on Democracy in the 1920s, he concluded from his reflections and this experience that in a democracy, I'm quoting it now, the population must be spectators, not participants. The general population are ignorant and meddlesome outsiders, and the responsible men, as he said, they're the ones who should run the country. The public must be put in its place, he said, so that the responsible men can live free of the trampling and roar of the bewildered herd. It's the great beast, as Alexander Hamilton described the people. And that's the way a democracy should run, and that's the role of the responsible men. He didn't go on to explain. Anybody who talks, there's a long tradition of this, and the people who write it never ask, why am I a responsible man while Eugene Debs is in jail? But the reason is, maybe the question answers itself. In any event, Lippmann was a highly respected public intellectual for half a century. He's the dean of American journalism, sort of leading figure in American journalism through much of this century. He was often actually critical of the exercise of power, but within extremely narrow limits. Debs, on the other hand, was not one of the responsible men. He was on the wrong side. He was a voice of the voiceless, like many others, back to the prophets, in fact. Well, equally important, though he took a different path, was Edward Bernays. He became the leading figure in the public relations industry, which was just took off after the First World War. Again, to a large extent influenced by the success of propaganda during the First World War, the propaganda of the more thoughtful men of the community and the British who were feeding them their lines. The PR industry was a huge industry, enormous industry. It's entertainment and advertising and all sorts of things. Just to indicate how large it is, in the United States, about something like 1/6 of the economy of the gross domestic product is spent in marketing. That's around $1 trillion a year, which means anything from packaging to advertising to straight propaganda and so on. From the early part of the century, the PR industry has held, in the words of its own leaders, that their goal is to do what they call controlling the public mind, fighting the everlasting battle for the minds of men. Those are all quotes. They have to, what they say, indoctrinate people with the capitalist story so that they can repeat it from memory. And this is particularly important because the greatest hazard facing industrialists is the rising political power of the masses, and since, at least by the 1930s, it was becoming harder to control them by state violence, other means had to be emphasized, particularly propaganda. Bernays was the leadership of this movement in the 20s. He wrote one of the major manuals of the PR industry. It was called Propaganda. You should remember that prior to World War II, the word propaganda didn't have bad connotations, so people used it freely. After World War II, it had unpleasant connotations, so you use some euphemism, but still is propaganda. Anyway, in the 1920s, he wrote a book entitled Propaganda, for a PR manual, and in fact, the manual of the PR industry, public relations industry. He opens by saying that the conscious and intelligent manipulation of the organized habits and opinions of the masses is an important element of democratic society, and it's the intelligent minorities, Lippmann's responsible men, the commissars, who must make use of propaganda continuously and systematically. They must, he said, regiment the minds of men just as an army regiments their bodies, and he said we now have the means to do that, to regiment minds as efficiently as armies regiment bodies. This, he went on to say, is the essence of democracy that he repeated in 1948, shortly before he was honored for his achievements by the American Psychological Association. And the achievements were considerable. The first achievement that propelled him into fame in the 1920s was running a program for Lucky Strike, direct designed to get women to smoke. Women weren't smoking then, and there was a whole business about how it's nice to smoke, model smoking and all this kind of thing. Nobody can estimate exactly how many corpses that one brought about. Plenty. Another later achievement for which he was properly famous was building up public support for the CIA coup in Guatemala in 1954, which extinguished the Guatemalan democracy and left the place as a living hell with hundreds of thousands of people slaughtered and horrors going up to the present. Throughout all this period, he was honored as a New Deal Kennedy liberal, which indeed he was. He was a typical standard New Deal Kennedy liberal and is properly respected for that. That's a responsible man. Debs had a different fate, or for example, Fred Hampton, a black organizer in the Chicago ghetto, who was murdered in 1969 in a police raid set up by the FBI. The facts on this are not in doubt. It's all gone through the courts, and decisions are out there. You can read it in judicial opinions. This was part of a much broader program, COINTELPRO program, which went through 4 administrations, at least Kennedy, Eisenhower, Kennedy, Johnson, and Nixon, picked up in the Kennedy administration, and continued right through the 60s, started targeting particular groups, ended up targeting all of dissent, all of dissent, using quite repressive, sometimes extremely violent means. The assassination is the perhaps extreme case. The information about the Hampton assassination, and in fact the whole COINTELPRO program, that came out exactly at the same time as Watergate was exposed. And it sets up a kind of controlled experiment. You can ask yourself what these 2 incidents were like and what was the reaction to them. One is a program carried on by 4 administrations, run by the National Political Police, the FBI, a massive program of widespread repression, which went as far as straight, outright political assassination. The other was, had nothing to do with the National Political Police. It was a couple of kind of Keystone cops picked up for unknown reasons, who went into the Democratic headquarters and stole some files for unknown reasons, and with no effect. That's Watergate. In comparison to COINTELPRO, Watergate is just like a tea party, like maybe, back pages, small item. COINTELPRO is the big story. But ask yourself how it was reported and how it stands in historical memory, and you learn a lot about our topic, about commissars and dissidents, and about our own intellectual culture. The difference between the 2 was quite simple. The Nixon administration made the stupid mistake of going after people with power, and people with power know how to fight back. They attacked the commissars and the powerful institutions that are behind them, and they don't take it. So that became a huge scandal. On the other hand, COINTELPRO attacked the voiceless, the defenseless, the weak, the ethnic minorities, the working people, others who don't count, the ignorant and meddlesome outsiders who constitute the general population. So therefore, what was done to them by the National Political Police right through 4 administrations, that kind of didn't matter much. Well, that tells you a lot about our topic, commissars and dissident, responsibility of intellectuals. Shortly after the Hampton assassination, David Rockefeller founded the Trilateral Commission. It was concerned, this is mostly liberal elites, like the group around Carter, basically, including Carter himself, and their counterparts in Europe and Japan. That's the Trilateral Commission. They were put together to deal with a crisis. It was called the Crisis of Democracy. In fact, they published an important book on this, which you should read. It's right about this topic, called The Crisis of Democracy. The Crisis of Democracy was that during the 1960s, in all of the trilateral countries, the Western democracies, Japan counts, Japan, Europe, and the United States, in all of them, the population, the ones who were supposed to be spectators, the ignorant and meddlesome outsiders, were trying to get into the act. people were becoming organized and active and trying to get into the public arena to press their demands. And that was causing a crisis because they don't belong there. That's a crisis of democracy. Democracies are supposed to be run by tiny, narrow elites who work for the powerful. That's the way they're supposed to work, but since this was happening, there was a crisis of democracy, and democracies were becoming ungovernable, and it was necessary to somehow return the mass of the population, the great beast, to its cage, to return them to apathy and obedience and fragment them and break up all these things so that democracy in the approved sense can survive. If you think this is a caricature, I suggest you read the original. This is no caricature. Part of their concern was with what they called the institutions responsible for the indoctrination of the young. That includes the churches, the schools, and the universities. And they were getting out of control. The young were not being properly indoctrinated. And that means we got a crisis of democracy. They made a distinction there between what they called the technocratic and policy-oriented intellectuals and the value-oriented intellectuals. The technocratic and policy-oriented intellectuals are the good guys. They're the ones who serve the interests of power. They're the commissars. The value-oriented intellectuals are the bad guys. They're the ones who are threatening the institutions that are responsible for the indoctrination of the young and getting people agitated and making them think about values and so on and so forth. The terms are kind of interesting. The idea that the value-oriented, they recognize the value, they know what they're doing, that's why you don't speak the truth to power. The value-oriented intellectuals are the bad guys, but that's true all through history. And what you need is technocratic and policy-oriented intellectuals, just obedient commissars who don't threaten anything. They're the responsible men, they're carrying out responsibility. So they were, one of their attempts, one of their concerns was how to control and get rid of these value-oriented intellectuals who were sort of getting in the way of governability of democracy. Well, the same, I don't want to suggest that this is only true of the United States. Let's turn to the other leading democratic society, Britain. Its leading intellectual through this century was undoubtedly Bertrand Russell. He was jailed during World War I, thrown out of his position at Trinity College, Cambridge. He was later, 20 years later, he was denied teaching position in the United States, City University, City College then. In his 80s, when he was in his 80s, Bertrand Russell was being arrested in civil disobedience in protests against nuclear weapons. He was also an early opponent of the Vietnam War, and in retrospect, a very accurate and incisive opponent. I think it was clear at the time, too, but now it certainly is. He was bitterly reviled. There was hysterical abuse against him in the New York Times, government officials, also by the more extreme apologists for terror and violence here, people like Sidney Hook, who particularly hated Russell. I suspect the reason has to do with a debate that took place in 1933 on why, whether you should be a communist or not, and Russell was against it and Hook defended it, and I think he never liked the fact that that incident took place. But whatever the reason, he really despised, he quickly changed a couple of years later. Hook despised Russell, and he condemned Russell for criticizing the, I'm quoting Hook, the unfortunate loss of life incurred by the efforts of the American military forces to help the South Vietnamese repel the incursions of the North Vietnamese and their partisans. These unfortunate loss of life took place, for example, during saturation bombing by B-52s in the densely populated Mekong Delta. There weren't any North Vietnamese within hundreds of miles. It wasn't until long after the United States had expanded its attack against the South to the north that anywhere around, and then at the fringes, all of this was with no illusions. You would have to delve pretty deeply into the annals of Stalinism to find any counterpart to this, but it's very much honored here. Russell, in contrary, was telling the truth, and he was reviled. Well, that pattern is standard, and it's instructive. It extends to the American dependencies, like, say, Central America. Here the punishment for dissidents is far more severe than in post-Stalin Russia and its satellites. That's a fact that's well understood in Central America, but suppressed here. I don't mean to say that the facts are suppressed. We know the facts. But what is suppressed is what they mean. That we're not supposed to see and we're not supposed to understand. The facts are symbolized well and accurately by the assassination of Archbishop Romero in 1980 and the assassination of 6 leading Jesuit intellectuals a decade later. That framed a decade of state terror and atrocities that left hundreds of thousands dead, millions of wounded and orphans and refugees, whole huge regions devastated, maybe beyond recovery. As the 2 events that frame the decade symbolize, it was in large measure a war against the church. The church, or at least segments of it, had undertaken what was called the preferential option for the poor, and priests and nuns were becoming, and lay Catholics were becoming directly involved in helping the suffering and oppressed people of one of the world's worst horror chambers. It's been under our firm control through the century, which also tells us something. The Archbishop and the Jesuit intellectuals were murdered by forces armed and trained and advised by the United States. Again, that's an eloquent symbol of the decade of terror that these events framed. If we were honest, we would describe this as a war against the people of our traditional Central American dependencies in a particularly brutal phase of a long history. I should say that the most effective, these are intellectuals that I happen to be talking about, and the most effective way to assassinate intellectuals is not just by blowing their brains out, as in the case of the Jesuits, but to suppress their words. So, for example, in the case of Archbishop Romero, who was a voice for the voiceless, it's actually his phrase about the priests who were assassinated, but it also applies to him. His voice actually produced words. You might try to find them. For example, you might try to find the letter that he wrote to President Carter in 1980, shortly before he was assassinated, in which he pleaded with President Carter not to send arms to the military junta, as the Carter administration then did, because the arms will increase injustice and sharpen the repression that has been unleashed against the popular organizations struggling to defend their most fundamental human rights. Well, those are his words. You might try to find them. The facts about the assassination were also suppressed, as well as the background, which is interesting. We have just passed the 20th, just a few weeks ago, the 20th anniversary of the assassination of Rutilio Grande, a priest in El Salvador. Romero had been appointed archbishop because he was considered extremely conservative and therefore safe, and he was. But then his own priests began to be killed. The killing of Rutilio Grande apparently struck him particularly hard. He's the one who Romero described as a voice for the voiceless. The 20th anniversary has just passed. There was a memorial commemorative mass in El Salvador where the Jesuit priest who gave the memorial said that we have forgotten the names of the president and the Supreme Court justice and the ones responsible for the murder of Rutilio, but we remember him. And you might ask yourselves whether we do remember him. So how many of you remember him or know what he did or commemorated the 20th anniversary of his assassination? And it's not your fault, it's the way the responsible intellectuals work. Or how many know what Archbishop Romero informed Father Echeverria, who's the rector of the Central American University, who was one of those assassinated 10 years later. At the time that he wrote his letter to Carter, Romero informed Echeverria that he did it because he was prompted by the new doctrine of special warfare, which consists of murderously eliminating every endeavor of the popular organizations under the allegation of communism or terrorism. for example, priests setting up Christian base communities, and so on. None of that is new. It wasn't the new doctrine of special warfare. It was newly being applied to El Salvador. But the doctrine of special warfare that he was talking about goes back to the Kennedy administration. Kennedy was fascinated with special warfare, which was straight, outright state terrorism, and was so described. Throughout, it led to an enormous plague of repression throughout the hemisphere, later in Southeast Asia. It was just reaching El Salvador in the 1980s, and that's what prompted Romero's letter, to which there was no response except to send the arms. And it still goes on. We're not talking about ancient history. In 1962, Kennedy sent a special warfare mission headed by an American Colonel Yarborough, to Colombia, where he advised the Colombian army on how to set up paramilitary forces and to conduct terror operations against known communist advocates, that's the phrase, and they did it, and they're still doing it, and they have the worst human rights record in the hemisphere. They now about 10 political killings a day, most of them traceable to the military and the paramilitaries, who we continue to arm. About half of U.S. military aid and training goes to Colombia, we're up close to increasing now, incidentally, specifically to forces that have been implicated by Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch and so on in terror and support for paramilitary terrorist organizations. Well, that's the doctrine of special warfare, and that's what Romero was, when it was coming to El Salvador, that's what inspired him to write his letter, all of which is sort of out of history. You can find it, but you're going to have to work hard. It's not up front where it ought to be, because this is the core of contemporary history right today. Well, let's go on. In the Central American satellites, the dissidents were murdered and tortured, or if they were luckier, they just escaped, fled, which also happened. For example, Rubén Zamora, who was a moderate social democrat who fled from El Salvador in 1980 when his brother Mario, who's Christian Democratic Attorney General, was murdered by the death squads, means us. Or, for example, Father Cesar Jerez died recently. He was the Jesuit provincial for Central America, originally in Guatemala, but he had to flee Guatemala when the special warfare trained forces said they were going to kill all the Jesuits, so he fled from Guatemala to El Salvador, where he was extremely close to the Archbishop Romero. In fact, Father Jerez actually wrote that letter in English that was sent to Carter. I knew him, we were friends. He told me that immediately, about a day or two after the letter reached Washington, Father Jerez got a call from the Vatican, calling him back to the Vatican for consultation with the order and with the Pope, in fact. What had happened was that the Carter administration had instantly put pressure on the Vatican. They knew who was doing it, it wasn't that hard to figure out, to somehow call off this troublesome priest who was trying to be a voice for the voiceless. And he was called back, he had his meetings, he went back to El Salvador. A couple of days later, the Archbishop was assassinated and he fled to Nicaragua, joining Rubén Zamora and Zamora's family, along with plenty of other writers and human rights activists and others. Managua in those days was playing more or less the kind of role that Paris played in the 1930s when anti-Stalinist and anti-Nazi intellectuals were fleeing there. Another part of history which we don't exactly have presented to us. Meanwhile, in El Salvador, independent newspapers were being blown up by bombing. Editors and journalists were murdered, forced to flee. There wasn't a peep of protest here. In fact, it was barely reported. The silence was particularly instructive by comparison to the huge outpouring of rage about the harassment of La Prensa in Nicaragua. La Prensa was supported by the country that was attacking Nicaragua. The fact that the United States was attacking Nicaragua is not my opinion. There's a World Court judgment condemning the United States for the unlawful use of force, that is international terrorism against Nicaragua. La Prensa was being supported by the attackers and was supporting the attack. It was calling openly for support for the terrorist forces attacking Nicaragua, the U.S.-run terrorist forces. The United States has never permitted anything remotely like that to function, nor has any other country, to my knowledge, but certainly not the United States, even when we're not under attack. In fact, our own record during wartime, when we've never been under attack for almost 200 years, is atrocious. But the fact that there was harassment of a newspaper run by the forces attacking the country and calling for support for that attack while it was going on, that was outrageous. But the blowing up of independent newspapers and the murder of journalists and editors in El Salvador was not only not outrageous, but not barely even reported. You can find a couple of lines. It's interesting, too. Now, I've been talking about intellectuals, but of course they were only a tiny fraction of those who were punished for dissidence. The vast majority of the victims were peasants and working people, poor, hungry, oppressed. Same's true in Colombia and other places. They're the people for whom the Archbishop and the Jesuits and Rutilio Grande and others were trying to be a voice. They're the ones who they were trying to protect and help, and that's the crime for which they were killed by our hands, as we would recognize if honesty were imaginable. Well, without going any further, this is the pattern that prevails right through history, as far as I can see. We're not untypical. It's normal, just as the Bible is not untypical, or the Soviet state. It's illustrated by the biblical record, by the two polar opposites in the contemporary world, the Soviet Union and the United States and their satellites, and you can trace it all the way back. Responsibility of intellectuals has two meanings. It has a meaning for the commissars, the people who are respected and privileged and so on, and for the dissidents who get one or another form of punishment. How violent it is depends on the nature of the society. In the freest and richest society in the world, I think we have a good bit to answer for in the past, in very recent history, and right today. It's still going on. The comparison of U.S. and Soviet satellites should make that obvious enough. I won't give any more historical examples, but merely mention that the comparisons might merit some further thought. Here's a further comparison that might merit some thought in my last one. A couple of weeks after the Jesuit intellectuals were murdered in November 1989, a few weeks later, after they had their brains blown out by elite military units who were fresh from U.S. training, the leading Czech dissident, Václav Havel, came to the United States. He addressed a joint session of Congress, and speaking to the joint session, he praised the United States as the defender of freedom, which had understood the responsibility that flowed from its great power. And he continued, "We must honor that inspiring model." He told Congress, you in other words, "and we must put morality above politics. The backbone of our actions must be responsibility to something higher than my family, my country, my company, and my success." For example, responsibility to, say, people in El Salvador or Guatemala or Timor or Indochina or the Gaza Strip or lots of other places people who can give direct testimony to the great works of the defender of freedom, which had just recognized its responsibility once again by its major role in blowing out the brains of 6 of Havel's counterparts in El Salvador, as he surely knew, and as his horde of admirers here also surely knew. Well, Havel received a rousing standing ovation in Congress for these marvelous remarks, and American intellectuals were absolutely enthralled right across the spectrum, all the way to the left liberal edge. They were enthralled by his praise for the defender of freedom and its responsibility to something higher, which it had just demonstrated once again by murdering the 6 Jesuit intellectuals in El Salvador, along with plenty of others, as usual. I'm talking about the intellectuals, but they just happen to stand out because, it's so noticeable. This gushing and rapturous response particularly from the left liberal extreme, that again is rather revealing, I think. It reveals something important and interesting about our own intellectual culture. One might ask, for example, what the reaction would have been if, say, Central American dissidents had gone to Russia and spoken in some official, the Politburo or somewhere, to praise Russia as the defender of freedom under similar circumstances, let's say just after it had murdered another bunch of intellectuals, which hasn't happened since the post-Stalin era. Well, of course, all that's unimaginable. The Central American intellectuals, including the assassinated Jesuits, they always showed great sympathy for their counterparts in Eastern Europe, who were suffering much less, I should say, and that was reciprocated regularly in the manner that I've just indicated. Well, that reaction here, again, teaches us quite a lot about the responsibility of intellectuals right here, if we choose to learn. And I will not go on with the current period, but there's plenty more to say about it. The picture does generalize very broadly, and of course the United States is not unique. Perhaps it's enough to quote another respected intellectual, who's much admired here. I'll end with this, Winston Churchill. Winston Churchill, in a secret paper, which was submitted to his cabinet colleagues in January 1914, says the following, honestly. He says, "We are not a young people with an innocent record and a scanty inheritance. We have engrossed to ourselves an altogether disproportionate share of the wealth and traffic of the world. We have got all we want in territory, and our claim to be left in the unmolested enjoyment of vast and splendid possessions, mainly acquired by violence, largely maintained by force, often seems less reasonable to others than to us. So we therefore have to resort to such doctrines as special warfare, which consists of murderously eliminating every endeavor of popular organizations to defend their most fundamental human rights." Well, that was in secret. Churchill did allow a highly expurgated version of this to reach the public in the 1920s, omitting all the crucial phrases. The original was just released after 80 years of secrecy, and no doubt it'll be a staple of school history in England, just as similar documentary and historical evidence, such as what I've just sampled, is a staple of education in our free society, as you all know from your schooling and up through elementary school to college, and today's newspapers and so on. Well, what is the responsibility of intellectuals? The answer to that is just truisms. There are plenty of good models. For example, the intellectuals we helped murder in El Salvador, and those who we continue to murder now as we silence their voices, and plenty of others. In fact, we all know the answer to the question, what's the responsibility of intellectuals? We just have to make a decision. The decision is to what extent or whether to choose to follow the path towards which that answer directs us, as we know, or to follow a different path, the path of the commissars, the technocratic and policy-oriented intellectuals, the responsible men, a historical vocation that we can trace back to the earliest recorded history, just as we can trace back the constant struggle for liberation and justice, and the choices always remain the same. Thanks. There's a mic over there, if anybody wants to chime in.
Hello. If the world is split, the commissars and dissidents in different places, and what is a commissar will be called a dissident eventually, and our present dissidents may be heroes. what is the possibility of having any real change on a global scale? I was interested in the doctrine that the professor who introduced you said, but the reflective person being one focus and the global truth being another one. But if your effect on global truth is volatile and ever-changing.
No, it's not. It's ever-changing, but if you think about it, it's changing for the better. And it's not changing for the better by any gifts from the gods.
Do you think focusing on personal change is the way to go?
Well, that's a decision you have to make, but I don't think so, no. But the fact of the matter is, if you look over time, today, first of all, the Soviet system of tyranny did collapse. Looking at ourselves, the counterpart of Eugene Debs would not be thrown into jail today, nor would Bertrand Russell be thrown into jail today, nor would Emma Goldman be kicked out of the country today, nor would labor be crushed in anything like the fashion it was crushed in the 1920s. Now, that's all unimaginable today. Things aren't great, and there's plenty of things wrong, but there's a lot that's much better. I mean, just think about today's problems. Like, say, today there's a problem of trying to maintain, this is a value judgment, maybe you have different values, but I'll speak for my own. There's a problem of trying to sustain and extend and strengthen the very meager healthcare system that we have. There was no such problem in the 1960s because we didn't have the system. Okay, so now it's a problem of trying to defend what in fact came out of the ferment of the 60s. What came out of the ferment of the 60s was there was a lot of pressure, which ended up in some degree of legislation. There was a thing called the war on poverty, which is, like most of these terms, kind of a joke. It was maybe like a small skirmish against poverty. It went on for about 2 years, and then it started declining. Like AFDC, the main welfare program, which was just killed, that has been declining steadily since 1970. From 1970 to 1990, it went down by about 50%. That was part of the general attack on women and families and children and so on that really picked up steam, and they, mainly under the Reagan administration, but by the late 70s. Actually, Nixon was our last liberal president, if you want to tell the truth. The last New Dealer, I mean. Or take, say, Social Security. Okay, now there's a problem of defending Social Security. In the 1930s, there was no such problem. There was no such system. Take, say, freedom of speech. That's one dimension on which the United States does rank very high. The United States does, freedom of speech is protected to a degree that I think has no counterpart in the world. At least I don't know of any. But remember how recent that is. Until the 1960s, freedom of speech literally didn't exist in the United States. Until the 1960s, you could be jailed for seditious libel. That's the keystone that's the hallmark of a free society. Seditious libel means assaulting the state by words. Okay? That was a crime in the United States, as it is in England today, for example, and in most of the world. It was a crime in the United States until the 1960s. It was finally struck down by the Supreme Court in the course of the Civil Rights Movement, and in fact as a reaction to activism in the Civil Rights Movement. Well, okay, that was a landmark, and there are others. But all of this is progress, and it shows that it's not true that things can't change. In fact, we know that they can change. They have changed. They've changed dramatically. Okay, maybe. But if you want to say, have we reached kind of heaven? No. Plenty of problems, but to say that nothing can be changed is just to ignore history. I mean, we don't have feudalism, we don't have slavery, there's a degree of women's rights, there's a degree of respect for other cultures, there are protections for fundamental human rights which didn't exist not long ago. Well, it wasn't given to anybody as a gift. It was won by struggle and by some people who joined the struggle and became voices for the voiceless, which anybody can do. They weren't preaching to them, incidentally. They were joining them.
Professor Chomsky, speaking of Nixon, I grew up Quaker. There's a Quaker spiritual, and 2 and 2 and 50 make a million. Then we'll see those walls come down. You seem to imply that any mass movement is either going to be suppressed or co-opted by the commissars. Do you see do you see that there is can you cast a pattern or a blueprint for a mass movement which could be politically effective?
All the ones I just mentioned were politically effective. What I've just said is that they are politically effective. That's why we don't live under feudalism and slavery, and we don't have counterpart of Eugene Debs being thrown into jail, and we don't have hundreds of workers murdered by the state security forces because they're involved in strikes, as happened early in this century, and on and on and on. I mean, look, we had essentially slave labor in this century up until the 1930s. If you look at the South, after slavery was officially eliminated and after Reconstruction was beaten back, there was a slave labor system in the prisons. Prison labor in the South was an enormous system, blacks, of course, and it's the source of the big industrial revolution that took place in the South in the late 19th century, early 20th century, northern Alabama, Georgia, Tennessee, in that region, where there was a big industrial revival, mostly on the basis with slave labor in prisons, in other words, which the employers described as reliable and productive, not like those workers in eastern Pennsylvania and Ohio who were rambunctious and striking and that kind of thing. And these guys didn't need any benefits and so on and so forth. That's pretty recent, In Mississippi, it went on until the Second World War. Actually, since things are cyclic, remember, it's now being reinstituted. So we are now reinstituting a system of slave labor in prisons, which is nowhere near the scale of what it was in the early part of this century, and again is mostly black, and the drug war is mostly used as a pretext to try to drive them into that. And it's being reconstructed, and in fact it's very valuable for American corporations. Same reason, it's cheap labor, controllable, can't strike, no benefits. It's got all the things that economists tell you are good. It's a flexible labor force, meaning it's a flexible labor market. If you don't need them today, stick them in the cell, the state will pay for them. If you do need them today, pull them out of the cell and they'll work without making any fuss about benefits and things, so it's a perfect labor market. And it's being rebuilt, but nothing like the scale on which it was. Well, these are all victories that were achieved. They're not permanent victories, and sometimes things go backwards, as now. But they are achieved by popular movements, by exactly these popular movements fighting to defend the fundamental human rights, the ones who the Archbishop was talking about. And in El Salvador, they won some victories, too. I mean, they suffered a very brutal time, but they won some victories. Pardon? No, not at all. I mean, there are plenty of people who didn't end, there are plenty of people who remained alive. I mentioned the ones who got murdered, right? I mean, it's true that dissidents aren't welcome, but the way in which the reaction to them depends on the nature of the society. In our satellites, that's true. They tended to get their brains blown out or be cut up to pieces with machetes and so on. Other societies are somewhat different. At home, it's changed. It used to be much harsher than it is. I mean, for us to talk about repression is a joke, to tell you the truth. I mean, dissident intellectuals in the United States are so privileged as compared with just about anybody in the world, so protected, that for them even to mention the word repression in regard to themselves is a sick joke. I mean, maybe the worst that will happen is somebody will yell at you or you won't get a job. There are worse fates.
Yesterday you said that...
Incidentally, if I can mention, I have to qualify that. That's true of dissident intellectuals in the United States who are from the more privileged and wealthy sectors. It wasn't true of Fred Hampton, for example. Then you can still get murdered.
Yesterday you said that in the last, I think it was 20 or 30 years, the standard of living for 80% of this country has been either stagnant or declining. And today you said that the powerful know what is going on. Do you think that all of the 20% at the top understand what is going on, the big picture that you present in your books? And if not, is there any hope that a significant portion of those people can learn what is going on and develop a conscience and join with those who are trying to change things?
Well, I can't say everybody knows what's going on, but it's like what I was just describing. What you just described is completely open and public. I mean, I'm not giving you any news. You know, this is all over the newspapers. If you want real details, I mean, the place to look for details is every 2 years there's a big study that comes out called State of Working America. The edition for 1996 just came out. I think it's called 1996, 97. It's edited by Lawrence Michel and Jared Bernstein, a couple of others. And that's like a huge statistical compendium that has all of this data in it if you really want it. But this basic story is known by everyone. You can read it. I mean, it's known by anyone who wants to bother to know. I mean, maybe you don't want to bother to know. But it's all perfectly public information, right in the mainstream, you know, completely obvious. It's not interpreted the way I interpreted it. It's interpreted as the mysterious workings of you know, the market and its wisdom and so on and so forth. I mean, there's all kind of phrases for it. There's nothing much to do with the market. It's very definite social policy. Do the people who are involved know what they're doing? Well, I mean, of course they do. Take, say, Newt Gingrich this morning, okay? This morning you read the newspapers, I mean, even USA Today, you know, I happened to pick up USA Today in the hotel, you know, place where they serve coffee. So there's an editorial. USA Today is not a big radical rag. Okay, they have an editorial pointing out the obvious. You know, the obvious. I mean, to anybody who has one gray cell functioning. Newt Gingrich made a speech yesterday in which he called for cutting off capital gains taxes and estate taxes. Well, who benefits by eliminating capital gains taxes and estate taxes? Well, the top 1% of the population, overwhelmingly. Then, you know, tiny effect going down. I mean, the editors of USA Today are perfectly aware of that. They're also aware, they may not, if they're aware of it, they didn't say it, but they may not, they say, well, Gingrich also has a statement in which he says, well, this is really important because that'll free up more funds for investment. Well, you know, I don't know if he reads like exotic journals like Business Week, but if he does, he or maybe somebody in his staff knows that the business world in the United States has a big problem now, what Business Week calls a vexing problem. They have about $680 billion of liquid assets that they don't know what to do with. And that's a vexing problem for companies like Intel and Ford and, you know, GE and a bunch of others that they list. So therefore, the solution is to free that. Apparently, that 2/3 of $1 trillion won't do for investment funds. So we have to give them some more money for investment funds. Meanwhile, cutting down food stamps for hungry children. You know, now if you ask the people know this, well, you know, it's pretty hard to answer. If they don't know it, it's even worse than if they do know it. Because it is so obvious. It is so on the surface. You know, you don't have to look at any hidden document. You don't even have to bother reading below the headlines. You know, so yeah, if you want to know it, you know it. But I think the way you put the question is mistaken. At least I think, for the reasons I mentioned. They know it, and it doesn't make sense to ask them to join with other people to try to change it. They're the ones who are implementing it and benefiting it from it, not because they're bad people, because that's the way the institutions work. If they weren't doing it, it's like suppose you convinced the CEO of General Electric that he shouldn't be doing that. He should be a voice for the voiceless. He should be organizing in the slums. And suppose he agrees with you. He said, okay, I'm going to organize in the slums. What happens to General Electric? Does it change? No. Somebody else is appointed CEO, and it continues to increase profit and market share, because that's the institutional role in it. It's got to do that. So trying to convince these people, look, to go down to speak to Newt Gingrich and say, hey, look, here's what you're doing. He knows that. I mean, Newt Gingrich knows, certainly, that he holds the national championship in bringing federal subsidies to his rich constituents. He knows that. Certainly knows that, just as the editors of the New York Times know it. And they don't report it, but they know it. To be precise, he's actually third. For suburban counties in the country, the top federal subsidies go to Arlington, Virginia, which is part of Washington, so that's where the Pentagon is and so on. So it's part of the federal government. The second one is Brevard County, Florida, which is the home of the Kennedy Space Center, so that's part of the federal government. But as soon as you step out of the federal government, Cobb County, Georgia, is the chief recipient. And he's determined to make sure that his rich constituents keep in their cycle of dependency. He understands that. There's no point telling him. They can therefore talk about their conservative values and their entrepreneurial this and that while they're getting more federal subsidies than anyone else in the country. Okay? Now he knows that. There's no point going down and telling him. There's no point going to the newsroom of the editor of the New York Times, or for that matter the Star Tribune, and telling them, because they know it too. If they decide not to report it, that's their business, but they certainly know it. Okay? So what's the point of telling them? It's for precisely this reason that I think that the slogan of "Speak Truth to Power," though I admire the people, is the wrong idea. They're not the people to whom you want to speak truth, and in fact you don't want to speak to anyone. But that's not the way to direct one's actions. It's exactly the way that Rutilio Grande and Eugene Debs and Archbishop Romero and others were saying. That's the way to do it. It's the only way that's ever worked in history, by working with the powerless. One more question.
Professor Chomsky, could you please interpret the deceptive language of the School of America's torture manuals and perhaps compare yourself with if Michel Foucault, if he was here today, what would he feel of the language as well?
Michel Foucault is a person I knew and kind of liked, but to tell you the honest truth, don't much understand. I understand maybe 5% of what he writes, which ranks him rather high among respected Paris intellectuals, I should say. It usually gets to 0.001%. But in his case, as I say, I knew him and I understand maybe 5%. So I suppose he would describe this in some very complicated trisyllabic postmodern words. I don't know. But what it is like anything we understand, pretty simple and straightforward. It was a torture manual. There's nothing very complicated to explain. You don't need discourse analysis or any of that kind of stuff. Perfectly simple language. It was a torture manual. It was exactly what the Kennedy team in Colombia. I mentioned Colombia because it's the worst human rights violator in the hemisphere this minute. Like 10 political assassinations a day is not small, and that's mostly peasants and teachers and organizers and the members of 30. I'm just taking this from the last State Department, official State Department Human Rights Report, so nothing controversial. 3,500 members of it's called a democracy. We praise it as a democracy. It even has an opposition political party, of whom 3,500 members have been assassinated by the guys we arm since it was set up about 10 years ago, including presidential candidates and mayors and so on and so forth, but it's a democracy. So therefore we can keep sending the arms there. Well, when Colonel Yarborough was sent by the Kennedy administration in 1962 to Colombia to explain to them about the new counterinsurgency techniques, what was called special warfare, he advised them, and it's on record, it's not secret, to set up paramilitary organizations and to carry out terrorist activities against known communist advocates. Known communist advocates means people like Rutilio Grande, for example. In fact, anyone who's breaking the rules is a known communist advocate. It's on the public record. Okay, the Army School of America's terror manual, which was just exposed, is just another example. We got a pile of examples this high. Yes, states are involved in terrorism, of course. It's one of their main activities. The United States is a big power, and it runs a lot of the world, including this region. And mostly, often it's had to resort to terror, pretty frankly. There's plenty of documentation about it. If you want to be surprised every time there's a new example, okay, but there's no reason to. And you don't need any fancy discourse to discuss this. It is extremely simple and straightforward. So Michael McClintock, for example, has a book called, he's an Amnesty International researcher, he was at the time, has a book called Instruments of Statecraft, came out a couple of years ago, in which he just runs through a lot of this material, no postmodern words. You can understand every single sentence. It's not like, and he tells you exactly, he just gives you documentation and analysis and discussion of the various techniques of state terror that are used to control people. In fact, Archbishop Romero's statements, which I quoted, are also perfectly transparent. I don't think there's anything complicated about this.
So is what you're saying is the government, when they're creating a manual such as this, would they be utilizing any linguistic model at all?
There's no linguistic
No.
model. Come on. Look, I mean, there's no more of a linguistic model than there was when Genghis Khan tortured people. You know? I mean, torture is torture. It's straightforward. You know, you don't have to have big fancy words for it, and there's no complicated models. The complicated models are set up by intellectuals who have career interests and so on and so forth. But anything that is understood about the world, we don't understand much about human affairs, and what we do understand, you can put in monosyllables, I think.
Thank you.
Professor Chomsky will be speaking again this evening. Professor Chomsky will be speaking again this evening at 7 o'clock at Hamline University. I'm sorry, we're keeping to a pretty tight schedule this afternoon.
You want one more question?
One more? Okay. One more question. And we really have to go.
Yes, somebody.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Whenever the United States gets into a public war, that is, the last one was when George Bush designed to ask Congress for the declaration of war. They always bring up Hitler. They always bring up Hitler in some way. And they'll refer to him quite a bit. Can you just comment on how this does resonate when this happens? No doubt why they do it. And can you comment on this, on how this can be diffused in some way, or perhaps placed in some kind of perspective that allows one to view this war, the upcoming war, for itself independently?
Well, remember, the Gulf War was an executive war, and the history of executive wars goes back to 1818, when Andrew Jackson conquered Florida from its inhabitants, brutal, murderous war, and it continues through then, and he wasn't referring to Hitler. In 1917, around then, 1917, those years when Woodrow Wilson invaded Haiti and the Dominican Republic, devastating, and they stayed in Haiti for 20 years, wrecked the place, killed thousands of people, I mean, turned them into U.S. plantations. They weren't invoking Hitler. You know. In fact, if you think about Hitler, the United States didn't go to war against Hitler. We might as well get the facts straight, at least. The United States went to war when first an air base in an American naval base in an American colony was attacked by Japan, and the next day Germany declared war against the United States, and then the United States went to war. Okay. Until then, the United States was mostly supporting Hitler. So into the late 1930s, we have the documentary record now from that period, as late as 1937 at least, the State Department was advocating support for Hitler as a moderate who was standing between the extremes of the right and the left, you know. And they said, unless we support Hitler, there's the mass popular organizations, you know, with the Soviet Union behind them, will do this and that horrible thing. So we have to continue to support Hitler. That was 1937, you know. I mean, it wasn't until Hitler just kind of got out of hand and sort of started attacking Western interests that the United States got involved. None of the other stuff mattered much. The United States passionately supported Mussolini. You know, Mussolini was loved. He was that admirable Italian gentleman, as President Roosevelt described him. The business world loved him. In fact, American investment poured into Italy right after the fascist takeover, when they destroyed the unions and smashed the democracy and so on. And when Hitler took over, American investment started pouring into Germany. You know, it was second only to England during the 1930s. There was no objection to Hitler except that he got out of line, you know, started attacking Western interests. And the same is true all the way to the present. Let's take, say, the Gulf War. What about Saddam Hussein? You know, I mean, this I remember very well. Back in the late 80s, I was trying to get journalists to publicize U.S. aid to Iraq. And they wouldn't. I mean, I wasn't the only one, of course. Here, I'll tell you a story. There's people better placed than me. A friend of mine was the Middle East correspondent for ABC television. I couldn't tell this story now, but since then he has resigned in disgust, couldn't stand it any longer, so we can tell the truth about what happened. He doesn't lose his job, in other words, because he quit. But he was their Middle East correspondent, and he was, like other people, trying to expose the fact that the United States was strongly supporting Saddam Hussein, very strongly, in fact, right through the period when he was gassing Kurds and torturing dissidents. All this stuff was known, but he was a nice guy, you know. In fact, he remained a nice guy up until August 1st, 1990, when he crossed a line that he wasn't supposed to cross. All the atrocities were before, and we were supporting it. Well, this friend of mine, Charlie Glass, who, if you watch television, you've seen on television, he's the Middle East correspondent for ABC TV, or was, he managed to, using French commercial satellites, which are not high resolution, you know, they're not like the Pentagon satellites, but using French commercial satellite information, he was able to locate biological warfare facilities in Iraq. This would have been in 1989, I think. And he managed to get Iraqi military defectors who were in London, and putting that information together, he was there, you know, actually generals who had defected and were in London, who told him what was going on, and putting that together with satellite information, he managed to put together a story, releasing the fact that Iraq, our big ally, who we were supporting enthusiastically, was building, not only torturing, you know, not only gassing people and torturing people and murdering them and so on, but was also building biological warfare facilities. Well, I happened to fly with him from London to New York. He wanted to release the information in New York, not London, because he wanted to provide a kind of a cover for the Iraqi defectors, you know, make it a little harder for Iraqi intelligence to figure out who they were. And so he went to New York, and you know, he told me he's going to get ABC to show this stuff, and I looked. And in fact, yeah, ABC television gave him, you know, Peter Jennings and that business, gave him a minute or two to present his information. Then they immediately switched to Washington, to the Pentagon, where their Pentagon reporter came in. And he says, the Pentagon says this is complete nonsense, forget it. I mean, it's all a lot of crazy fabrications. Okay, that was, you know, I think that was late 1989. Charlie Glass and others, including me, were trying to publish, just release the fact that the Bush administration was announcing publicly that it was sending new aid and support to Saddam Hussein, its big friend. It went on right into early 1990, you know. Saddam Hussein became a bad guy when he disobeyed orders. And if he wanted to carry out atrocities, that's fine, you know. Then suddenly became Hitler, you know. He became, and in fact, it's a good analogy. He became Hitler when he started damaging serious Western interests. Nothing to do with atrocities. The same was done before Hitler, the same was done after Hitler. We didn't oppose Hitler because of the atrocities. We didn't oppose Saddam Hussein because of the atrocities. So if you like, the analogy is accurate. It's just that, you know, it's accurate because it's all irrelevant. And they're all equally irrelevant to the reasons why the policies were taken the way they were. How do you deal with all of this? Well, get people to face the facts. You know, nothing that I've just said is secret. So if people face the facts, they can see quite easily that these have, there's nothing to do with it. I mean, let's take this morning's paper, okay, as recent as you can get. Today, April 14th, it's April 14th, right, is the day on which the European Union was going to bring to the World Trade Organization a complaint against the United States for violating the World Trade Agreement by its embargo against Cuba. The embargo against Cuba is not a joke. It's the harshest embargo in the world, in history. It denies food and medicine. It's causing very harsh effects in a poor country, which we have been attacking for 30 years. President Clinton, who's, I suppose, trying to get the record as the biggest coward in the history or something, has a statement today saying we can't, you know, they killed Americans and so on. Well, yeah, that's bad. It's supposed to be the other way around. We're supposed to kill Cubans. They're not supposed to kill Americans. So, for example, when the U.S., when one of Kennedy's terrorist teams blew up a Cuban petrochemical facility, killing 400 people, that was okay. I mean, it didn't matter. But killing so-called Americans, namely Cubans who are flying into Cuban airspace and dropping leaflets telling people to revolt and so on, and they warned them, and when they didn't go back, they shot them down. It's a crime, no doubt, but like if Libyan planes came into flying over Washington, say, telling people to revolt, we would garland them with flowers, I guess, or something like that, especially after 30 years of Libyan terrorism against the United States that had existed. Okay, so that's that, but take a look at the World Trade Organization, and just look at what's behind it. It's an answer to your question. When the European Union brought the charge against the United States, everyone assumes the United States would lose if it went to the World Trade Organization. So the United States therefore declared that the World Trade Organization is an improper forum, like the editor, for the obvious reason that if we go there, we're going to lose. Okay, and in fact, the U.S. withdrew from the negotiations, which makes them null and void. But they had a reason. The reason was there were two reasons, three reasons. Well, two main reasons. One is we're going to declare. The U.S. declared it's a national security exemption. If you're polite, you're not supposed to remember that when Kennedy tried to organize the American states to, in his first big attack against Cuba, Mexico said they couldn't join. And the reason they couldn't join, the Mexican ambassador said, was because if we state publicly that Cuba is a threat to our national security, 40 million Mexicans will die laughing. Well, you're not supposed to remember that. Here, we're much more sober, so nobody died laughing. Also, there's no reported deaths from laughter about the second reason, which was the following, and it's more interesting. The Undersecretary of Commerce, Stuart Eisenstadt, same guy as quoted this morning, said that Europe is challenging a 30-year-old policy of the United States aiming to overthrow the government of Cuba. Okay? And therefore, they certainly have no right to do that, because this is an established policy of the United States. They're interfering with our internal affairs. Okay? Assumption is we have a perfect right to overthrow the government of Cuba or do anything else we feel like in the world. It doesn't matter about international law or all this kind of nonsense. We've been at it for 30 years trying to overthrow that government by terror and violence and economic strangulation, and therefore it is our right. And for them to challenge it in the World Trade Organization as a violation of agreements is therefore really out of line. Well, that was in the New York Times. See if you can find a response. Actually, there was a response, and it was extremely revealing. There was a response by Arthur Schlesinger, who's a historian, who was in the Kennedy administration, and in fact was pretty much in charge of Latin America. He was kind of like Kennedy's Latin American advisor. Okay, and Kennedy says, well, he wants to inform his good friend, Stuart Eisenstadt, that he had misunderstood the policies of the Kennedy administration. The Kennedy administration, true, was trying to overthrow the government of Cuba, but I'm quoting it now, that's because of Cuba's troublemaking in the hemisphere and because of the Soviet connection. Okay? Well, he didn't say there was anything wrong with the policy, just he said he'd misunderstood the reason. So yeah, true, right to overthrow them, but now that's an anachronism because there's no Cuban troublemaking in the hemisphere and there's no Soviet connection. Well, Schlesinger didn't explain what those terms mean, but any educated American who wants to, anyone with access to a library can find out because the documents for that period have been released recently. So you look at the Foreign Relations of the United States, which I'm sure the library has, or if not, University of Minnesota certainly does, standard documentary source. Take a look at the documents that were just released about Latin America a couple of months ago. They include the report, Schlesinger's report to the incoming president from a Latin American mission, which he headed, describing the problem of Cuba. And contrary to what he says, the decision to overthrow the government had already been undertaken a year earlier, but put that aside. He describes the problem of Cuba. Here's what it is. Cuba's troublemaking in the hemisphere is the following. The spread of the Castro idea of taking matters into your own hands, an idea which has a lot of appeal to impoverished and oppressed people throughout Latin America who see the model of the Cuban Revolution in front of them and try to get a more decent life for themselves. That's Castro's troublemaking in the hemisphere. What's the Soviet connection? He defines that too. The Soviet connection is that in the background, the Soviet Union is offering development loans and presenting itself as a model for rapid development from third world conditions within a generation. That's the Soviet connection. Okay, tells you all you need to know. That's the history of the Cold War, the whole history, virtually. It has to do with all of these things. Troublemaking means, same kind of troublemaking that Rutilio Grande and Archbishop Romero and the Jesuit intellectuals were involved in. Same kind. The Soviet connection, yeah, sure, they were presenting themselves as a model. There's no Russians around. Well, okay, that's the real answer. How do you get people to understand this? Just bring the facts out. I mean, they're not going to be published in the Star Tribune. They're probably not going to be in textbooks. But that doesn't mean there's no way to do it. It is a very free society. We have a lot of opportunities and options. There's plenty of ways to get people to see these things. And then you don't have to bother talking to them about the Hitler analogy because it's too obviously absurd.
Thanking Professor Chomsky.